Good morning.
Good morning.
Um, Thank you, Joy, for being willing to talk about raising Jewish kids, not having grown up Jewish yourself in this month of December when we're just getting into the holiday spirit. And, for so many of us, we have interfaith family dynamics. And I think it's important to continually talk about our diverse community and who's in it and how to support each other. So I am grateful for the time this morning.
My pleasure.
Can you just in a nutshell kind of say who your family is and where you live and what you do? And then can you talk about how you were raised religiously, culturally, um, and kind of begin like that?
Sure. So I currently live in Glenview with my husband, David, and our two children, Rachel and Noah. And we've been members of Beth-El now for 15 years, I believe. So I grew up in upstate New York. I am the daughter of a Lutheran minister, and so was raised very much with the church community and the Lutheran faith being a huge part of my identity growing up in the church. I met my current husband, only husband, David, in graduate school. He is Jewish, and we dated 6.5 years before getting married. And I think a big part of that was navigating what our future would look like together as a couple and as a family, if we were going to get married. So,
Wow. Did religion come up right away as you started dating, or did it take some time?
I think it came up fairly early, honestly, when we started dating. We started dating in November, December, so it's certainly something that came up early, and I learned a lot from him, in terms of, and I should say my roommate at the time in graduate school was also Jewish. So, I went to a Lutheran undergraduate institution, partly because I got half tuition because my father was a Lutheran minister. So that was a big factor in that. So I really had not, I didn't have a lot of close connections with those who are Jewish. I grew up in a Catholic, Italian Catholic community. So being Lutheran was different in that sense. Like most of my friends were Italian Catholic in my working class neighborhood where I grew up, but I didn't have many Jewish friends or connections until I really went deep. I mean, I knew people who were Jewish, but not deep connections until I went to graduate school. And both my roommate and then my boyfriend, both were Jewish. So it really was an immersion into, just understanding at a deeper level what it meant to be Jewish.
What did both parents, what say? And, what were those conversations around saying, I'm seriously dating someone Jewish or Christian?
My parents were very, I think all of our parents were accepting. Although my dad had a deep Christian faith, and so did my mom, they were both very open and accepting, and always have been, of like, just in general, that's kind of who they were as people. And once they met David, they really, they could see why I, was in love with him. And David's family, interestingly, his mom grew up as a German Lutheran, which is what I am. She converted. So, David had some interfaith, growing up, and that his grandparents on his mother's side were Christian. And so that was also some part of his background as well. So they were also very accepting of me and our relationship. So we didn't have huge issues with family, thankfully.
Wow. How did you get married? Who ended up marrying you and how was that?
So, my dad died before we got married. So I should just say, it was really important for me. Like, my dad knew David. One of the very last things that I said to my dad before he died was, if I were to marry David and we were to have children and I raised them as Jews, would you be okay with that? And he gave his blessing. So that was for me very affirming, like, okay. So now, so it makes me tearful even thinking about that. So we got married in Vermont, which is where we were living at the time. It was really important to us to have a ceremony that reflected who we were as a couple and the family that we were going to want to create. It was hard to find a rabbi who was willing to marry an interfaith couple. And so we were not able to, the rabbis that we could find at that time, it felt more formulaic, and we didn't want something to be formulaic. And so there was in Middlebury, where we were living, the Jewish leader of the Haburah, who was a lay leader. He was a judge. So he was able legally to marry us. And then my father's best friend, who was a Lutheran minister, came and married us. So they did it jointly. But we spent a lot of time planning our ceremony so that it was very meaningful and reflected who we were and who we were going to be as a couple, and integrated both faith traditions. So we had a chuppah. The tablecloth on the top of the chuppah was from my grandmother. So we tried to integrate elements of my family and David's family and our joint faith tradition moving forward. So most people, like, the reception is the most meaningful part of their wedding, but I think most people who came to our wedding, it was like the wedding ceremony was really a reflection of who we were as a couple. So we wrote our own vows. We had this book on interfaith marriages, so we took like different elements of it to really thoughtfully incorporate what was most meaningful to us from our faith traditions to include.
Wow. So you knew you'd be serious about faith and traditions and religion. Both of you cared.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, we had agreed before we got married what we were going to do when we had children. I mean, it was real, and that was probably the biggest part of our negotiation as a couple. It was really important to David that his children be raised as Jews. David doesn't have as deep a religious identity as I did, or faith tradition, and he has a very strong Jewish identity. For me, growing up in the church and being part of a faith community was such an important part of my life and identity that really our compromise was like, if they're going to be raised Jewish, and I got a sense, I understood why it was important for Jews to continue to raise their children as Jews. You know, I understood that at a deep level, that there's a commitment to continue the Jewish identity because of the minoritized space that Jews are in. So I understood that. And it was important to me that if they were going to be raised as Jews, that they were going to have a strong Jewish identity and we'd be a part of a Jewish community. And so that was the compromise, really. David was not an active member in a temple growing up. He had a strong Jewish identity. He lived for a year in Israel as a gap year between high school and college. Most of his friends are Jewish, but the faith piece was not as important to him, but it was important to me. And so that was the compromise, that, you know, if they're going to be Jewish, they're going to be Jewish. And so, you know, we joined Beth-El. Our kids have gone to Jewish camp. They both have very strong Jewish identities at this point.
Yeah. No, I think that the Jewish world should understand how important the role is of the parent, often who's not Jewish, who says, I want a community, we are going to do this. Because the Jewish parent may have said, I'm secular, I'll raise them with holidays.
Right.
And, you know, because of the other parent who's grown up in organized religion in a way that, you know, we bring in the Jewish parent. Have there been challenges or barriers along the way for you in that?
Of course, right. I mean, I think, you know, the holidays are always something to navigate and negotiate collaboratively. Life events are also important moments to, you know, navigate, you know, deaths, births, weddings, you know, like those, you know, you have to talk about it. I mean, I think that's the most important thing. Like, well, what does this bring up for you? How are we going to do this thoughtfully? So we celebrate all of the holidays in our house. And yet with, like, we don't have a nativity scene. We have a tree, but we do not, like, David really did not, you know, want baby. And I understood. So although I have a beautiful olive wood from Jerusalem, the nativity scene from my parents that they got, it's, you know, I have it. I don't put it on display because I know that is triggering for him to have in our house. But we negotiate how we'll celebrate the holidays, and we talk through weddings, baby namings. You know, like when we had Rachel, it's like we had, you talk about it in concept, like, oh, when we have this baby, it's like, oh, then when this baby's born, I was like, okay, she's not going to be baptized. We're gonna have a baby, right? Like, so then that was real. But like my mom came and she, carried Rachel in at the beginning of her baby naming, and Rachel wore my christening gown, which was my mother's christening gown. So we incorporated parts of my family tradition, but brought it into the baby naming. So
that seems like such a beautiful, meaningful, compromise in a way to say, like, my past isn't erased, and it isn't right, like that there's these meaningful elements that won't seem contradictory in any way to.
right. Yeah, so I have a picture of Rachel at her baby naming wearing my christening gown,
This is amazing.
which my mother also wore. So I mean, it's like it's been in our family for,
Yes.
and all of my nieces and nephews as well.
Joy, I think there's a blog in this. Okay.
No.
Did the Jewish elements, have you felt over the years that the Hebrews become familiar and the rituals have become familiar, and somehow it's personally meaningful to you now as well?
It is. And what's interesting? So one of the first services that I went to at Temple, when I heard the benediction, right, I could hear my dad's voice, and it was like, this is going to be okay. Like I can do this. And I do think it is easier for Christians to be comfortable in the Jewish community because the Old Testament, that's familiar, right? And so I think it is easier in some way. Doesn't feel contradictory necessarily, but I felt like I could literally hear my dad's voice. I was like, I can do this. This is going to be fine. And we started going to Tot Shabbats. And so I learned the Jewish prayers with my kids at Tot Shabbat. It was actually a really wonderful introduction for me. So the Shema and right, like many of those prayers I learned along with my young children. So it became more familiar. I mean, the first few years, I didn't know the way the services would go, but now it does feel familiar. And for me, it's just being in a spiritual place. I am very spiritual. So it's like I can find that space in the temple or in a church.
Right. Have you, like, where are you with your own Christianity today? Like, do you, are there parables that still you all reread or that touch you, or music, or being with extended family? Like, are there times that you feel like you want that familiar, or it's not your?
There are times I miss it, but I don't regularly go to church. I don't. I have not joined a church community here. I go periodically, but my faith community really has been Beth-El because I wanted to be with my family. But when we go to visit my extended family, I will go to church with them. During the pandemic, I actually attended church often with my mom through her, on Zoom, which was, nice to do. So there are times I miss that, but really I have community, a faith community, I think at Beth-El, which has been sufficient for me. But I do not intend to convert. I know people would ask me that. I'm like, no, I still identify as a Christian. But I'm very comfortable being a part of the faith community at Beth-El.
It's so beautiful. Do you feel like your kids have some Christian literacy now over the years, or?
That was important to me. So it was important to me that they had one faith. I mean, I think I should tell you, I did my my dissertation on interfaith relationships, not on children so much, but it was on interfaith relationship development. Ask any psychologist what their dissertation is. Like, research is me search. And so that I did a lot of that and learned about raising children. And a lot of what I learned was that for families who introduced their kids to both and said, you choose, they chose nothing, right? That because it felt like they would be picking one parent over the other. But that if they grounded their children on one faith tradition, but exposed them to another, they could be understand and not be, afraid or what have you, but have a strong identity. So that was what we decided to do. So our kids are clearly Jews, like that they identify as Jews, and yet they're comfortable in church space and, have gone to church with me on holidays or with their grandmother or their cousins for, their religious
It
celebration.
doesn't threaten their Judaism and their,
No. So they're comfortable in that space, which was important to me because
Yeah.
sometimes when you don't know the other, like you have this notion of what the other is. And, actually, if you were to ask David, he would say, knowing my father and being accepted and loved by my dad was huge for him, as a young Jewish male who had these notions of what ministers say or do, and what happens in a church setting, which was completely not his experience with my dad, or our church. So I think that was healing for him in some ways too, just being like, okay, like all these things that I thought are not, not really what happens. So
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it can be hard for the parent who's not Jewish to know to what extent they can share their lives and their upbringing and the stories that touch them and the songs that they grew up with and parts of what sustain their own faith because they don't want to confuse or and I think that right to know that it's just going to be enriching, and whatever feels comfortable. But I think that that is a path that's not often talked about for the parent who's not Jewish,
mhm,
of what they're not sharing or wish that they had or would or
mhm,
something. So that permission almost to say,
mhm.
your kids are going to want to know all of you and be
Right.
able to ask questions
Yeah.
and
So they've grown up knowing they're Jewish. I am not. Mom's family is not. And so, but
yeah,
they feel comfortable in that space.
yeah, it's so, I mean, yeah, interfaith kids, I think, who understand commonality and the beauty of differences and asking questions and just the complexity and ambiguity of life, I believe are going to be our bridge builders. I mean,
I completely agree. And I think it translates beyond faith to other ways of, bringing connections to people who have different identities than we do,
right.
whether it's race, sexual orientation, you name it, right? It's just like when you take time to really build meaningful, deep relationships with somebody who has a different identity than you do,
Right.
you do see there's a common humanity.
And then seeing your parents who grew up, differently in some ways, but to see what's shared and their depth of respect for each other and openness and compromise and willingness to learn and try. And I mean, what better foundation for a loving partnership?
I hope, yeah. And they see the conflict over, there are times conflicts come up. I think one of the things that was hardest for me, especially at the holidays, as a young kid growing up Christian, I loved the Christmas season, right? Like it was special. I have all these wonderful memories of Christmas as a kid, Christmas Eve service with the candle lights with,
Right.
and knowing and hearing from David how painful it was for him as a young kid growing up Jewish in Indiana, like that there weren't many,
Yeah.
other members of the Jewish community. Like it took some of the joy away, knowing that something that brought me such pleasure could create such pain, for someone you love. But it also, gives you a deeper understanding of what it's, the minority, like it just gave me a deeper understanding. So being more mindful of that.
This has been so, I think this has been such a helpful conversation. And I hope that interfaith families in this community and outside the community will be able to listen and just, see themselves in the story and understand that, there's each family is going to navigate it in their own way and their kids are going to, um, hopefully know only joy and blessings from both sides of the family. And then I think, as our interfaith Jewish kids grow in the Jewish world, that they'll have to be advocates and ambassadors themselves for who they are and what is their identity and how they describe themselves. And I hope not be on the defensive about their status or their identity, but
I agree.
so anything else we should mention in this holiday season?
Take time to celebrate what's meaningful to you and share that with your families. I mean, I think that is, that's the most important part.
Thank you so, so much for taking the time this morning.